The emergency council session had been going for 18 hours when Counselor Ythmara made her proposal. The ancient being stood slowly, her form showing the weight of centuries, and addressed the assembled representatives with the authority of someone who had witnessed the last Terran era firsthand. "We have 3 choices," she declared, her voice carrying across the chamber. "We can flee, which will only delay the inevitable. We can attack, which our military analysis suggests will fail, or we can test them." Chancellor Vexhi's crystal form brightened with interest. Test them how? The ancient Terrans had specific characteristics that made them unique among galactic species. If these humans are truly the same people, they will display those same traits. If they have changed... She paused meaningfully. Then we need to know how they have changed. The chamber buzzed with discussion. Representatives from hundreds of species debated in languages that created a symphony of clicks, whistles, hums, and harmonics. Finally, the Chancellor called for order. "What kind of tests?" he asked. Ythmara activated a holographic display showing historical records. 3 characteristics defined the ancient Terrans. First, they could survive in environments that killed other species. Second, they could solve problems that we considered impossible. Third, they made decisions based on protecting others, even at cost to themselves. And if they fail these tests, then we know they are not the Terrans of old, and we can welcome them as the peaceful explorers they claim to be. If they pass... She let the implication hang in the air. "If they pass," Chancellor Vexhi said quietly, "then we know the galaxy's greatest fear has indeed returned." 2 hours later, Ambassador Sarah Chen and her team were escorted to what appeared to be a testing facility deep within the Council station. Sarah had expected conference rooms and diplomatic discussions. Instead, she found herself in what looked like a military training center. "Ambassador," Chancellor Vexhi explained, as they walked through corridors lined with equipment. She didn't recognize them. "The Council has decided that certain evaluations are necessary before we can proceed with formal relations." Dr. Martinez looked around nervously. "What kind of evaluations?" "Practical ones," the Chancellor replied. "We need to understand your species' capabilities. For diplomatic purposes, you understand." Sarah didn't understand, but she sensed that refusing would end any chance of peaceful relations. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" They stopped before a massive airlock door. Beyond it, through reinforced windows, Sarah could see what appeared to be an environmental chamber. The lighting was strange, and she could see frost forming on some surfaces while others seemed to glow with heat. "The first evaluation is simple survival," Vexhi explained. "This chamber simulates conditions on various worlds throughout the galaxy. Most species require significant protective equipment to enter safely. Dr. Kim, their xenobiologist, studied the readings displayed outside the chamber. Chancellor, these conditions would be lethal to most Earth life forms. The temperature variations alone." "Yes," Vexhi replied. "That is why this is a test." Sarah looked at her team. They had trained for hostile environments, but this was beyond anything they had prepared for. Still, refusing would likely end humanity's chances of joining the galactic community. "We'll do it," she decided. "I was afraid you would say that," Vexhi murmured. The humans entered the chamber wearing their standard exploration suits, equipment designed for the hostile environments of space, but not for the extremes they now faced. The temperature fluctuated between levels that should have frozen their equipment solid and others that should have melted it. The atmospheric pressure changed constantly, and the air composition shifted between mixtures that should have been immediately toxic. In the observation area, Council representatives watched with growing amazement. The humans weren't just surviving, they were adapting. When the temperature dropped, they moved closer together and adjusted their equipment settings. When it rose, they vented heat through their suits and found shade in the chamber's obstacles. When the atmospheric pressure changed, they adjusted their breathing and modified their equipment to compensate. "This is impossible," whispered Dr. Kexhan, the Council's chief medical officer. "Their survival adaptations are beyond what our models predicted. They're not just enduring these conditions, they're finding ways to be comfortable in them." Most disturbing of all, the humans were taking notes. Dr. Martinez was analyzing the atmospheric compositions, Dr. Kim was studying the temperature variations, and Ambassador Chen was discussing how similar conditions on their homeworld had prepared them for this environment. "Chancellor," Dr. Chen called out through her communication system, "these conditions remind us of winter training exercises in Antarctica. combined with high-altitude work in the Himalayas. It's challenging but manageable. How long would you like us to remain? In the observation room, several delegates made sounds of distress. 3 hours later, the humans emerged from the chamber apparently refreshed. Dr. Martinez immediately began discussing the interesting chemical compositions they had encountered, while Dr. Kim speculated about the types of worlds that might have such conditions naturally. Fascinating environment, Sarah commented to the Chancellor. Are these conditions common on inhabited worlds? We'd love to study the adaptations species have developed for such places. Chancellor Vexai's crystal form had dimmed to almost nothing. Please, he said quietly, come with us to the second evaluation. The next test took place in the Council's Strategic Planning Center, a facility normally used for addressing galaxy-wide crises. The humans were presented with a scenario that had been specifically designed to be impossible to solve. A space station with failing life support, multiple incompatible species trapped aboard, no available rescue ships, and insufficient resources to maintain life support for everyone. This is a scenario our best strategic minds spent months developing, explained Counselor Drexhan. There is no solution that saves everyone. The purpose is to see how you approach impossible choices. Sarah studied the information for several minutes, then gathered her team for discussion. The council representatives watched through one-way screens, expecting to see the humans struggle with an unsolvable problem. Instead, they watched the humans break the problem into smaller components and address each one systematically. Dr. Martinez analyzed the power systems and found ways to improve efficiency that the original designers had never considered. Dr. Kim identified biological compatibilities between species that allowed for shared life support systems. Engineer Thompson, who had been quiet during most of the diplomatic proceedings, redesigned the station's air circulation to support multiple atmospheric requirements simultaneously. Within 4 hours, the humans presented a solution that not only saved everyone on the station, but improved the facility's life support beyond its original specifications. The solution required cooperation between species, innovative use of available materials, and thinking in ways that apparently no other galactic civilization had considered. This is how they do it, Ythmara said quietly to the assembled observers. They don't accept that problems are unsolvable. They just approach them from directions no one else considers. The final test was designed to reveal the humans' moral character. They were presented with a scenario where they could ensure their own safe return to Earth, but only by allowing harm to come to council representatives they barely knew. The test was never completed. When the scenario began with council members apparently in danger, the humans immediately abandoned their own safety protocols and began working to rescue beings they had known for less than a week. Dr. Martinez risked his life to reach a trapped Kethmaran delegate. Dr. Kim endangered herself trying to save a crystalline being whose biology she didn't understand. Ambassador Chen coordinated a rescue effort that put every human life at risk to save aliens who, hours before, had been treating them as potential threats. Stop the test, Chancellor Vexai commanded. Sir? The test coordinator looked confused. Stop it now. They have answered the question. In the testing chamber, the humans were still working frantically to save people who were never in real danger. They had passed all 3 tests, but not in the way the council had expected. They were indeed the descendants of Terra, with all the impossible capabilities that implied. But they had also shown something the ancient records had mentioned, but the galaxy had chosen to forget: the Terrans' instinctive drive to protect others. As the humans were finally told that the test was over and no one had been in real danger, Ambassador Chen's only reaction was relief that everyone was safe. She showed no anger at being deceived, no resentment at the deception. Her first question was whether the tests had provided the council with the information they needed to move forward with diplomatic relations. That night, as the council debated the results, one fact was clear: the humans were indeed the children of Terra. But the question that terrified the galaxy was no longer what they were capable of doing. It was what they would choose to do with capabilities that apparently had grown even more formidable during their 100,000 years of isolation. The emergency session began 3 hours after the humans were escorted to secure quarters. Sarah had protested, insisting they were not prisoners, but the council guards were polite and firm. For their own safety, they explained, it would be better if they remained in the diplomatic wing while the council reviewed certain historical materials. In the great archive chamber beneath the council building, beings older than some civilizations gathered around crystalline storage devices that had not been accessed in millennia. The archive keepers were a special class within the Council, members of species who had devoted their entire existence to preserving galactic history. They were the memory of the galaxy, and today they were being asked to remember something most had hoped was forgotten forever. Archivist Zumthala was the eldest among them. Her species had been part of the galactic community for over 2 million years, and she personally had been maintaining the archives for 300,000 of those years. Her 6 arms moved gracefully over control surfaces that glowed in response to her touch, calling up data that had been buried in the deepest storage layers. "The deep archives are responding," she announced to the gathered council members. Her voice carried the weight of ages. "The files are heavily encrypted. It will take time to access them fully." Chancellor Vexai paced nervously in the center of the chamber. His crystal form flickered with anxiety patterns that even the humans could have read. "How long since these records were last accessed?" "According to the logs," Zumthala replied, her ancient eyes scanning data streams. 103,742 galactic standard years. The access codes are so old that several of the encryption languages are extinct. Around the chamber, representatives from the galaxy's oldest civilizations waited in tense silence. The Kethmoran delegate had recovered from his initial shock, but still remained connected to emergency life support. The Veltar delegation, beings of pure energy who had been part of the council since its founding, flickered with nervous patterns. "First, file accessed," Zumthala announced. The chamber filled with holographic displays showing star charts, planetary surveys, and what appeared to be military reports. "These are classified expedition records from the Second Galactic Expansion period." The displays showed a sector of space that included what the humans called the Sol system, but the information was different from current surveys. The third planet was marked with warning symbols that hurt to look at. Planet designation: Terra, Zumthala read from the ancient files. Classification: Death World, Class Omega. Warning: this planet exhibits environmental hostility beyond previously recorded parameters. Surface conditions include atmospheric composition, toxic to 97% of known species, temperature variations sufficient to kill most life forms, geological instability, radiation bombardment, and aggressive native biological systems. "But that's not the worst part," whispered Counselor Drexhan, whose species had first encountered Terra over 250,000 years ago. "Read the biological surveys." Zumthala's voice became quieter as she accessed deeper files. Dominant species, unknown classification. Initial contact attempts resulted in complete loss of survey teams. Species exhibits impossible survival characteristics, capable of functioning in environments that should be immediately lethal. Demonstrates tool use, complex social structures, and... She paused, her expression growing troubled. And an inexplicable drive to expand beyond their planetary boundaries. The holographic displays shifted to show what appeared to be contact reports. The images were unclear, corrupted by age, but they showed beings that were unmistakably humanoid. The reports described first contact attempts that had gone horribly wrong. The early expeditions underestimated them. Zumthala continued reading. The Terrans were initially classified as a primitive species confined to their death world. Contact. Protocols assumed they would be grateful for rescue from their hostile environment. Instead, she activated another file and the chamber filled with images of destroyed spacecraft, abandoned colonies, and what appeared to be entire star systems that had simply been evacuated. Instead, they began to spread. She finished. Every attempt to contain them failed. Every effort to establish diplomatic relations resulted in the Terrans somehow gaining the advantage. They didn't conquer through superior technology or numbers. They conquered through sheer impossible persistence. Chancellor Vexai moved closer to the displays. "What do you mean, impossible persistence?" "They never stopped," came a voice from the back of the chamber. Ancient Counselor Ythmara, whose species had been extinct for 50,000 years except for her, stepped forward. "I was there, in the early days. We thought we understood warfare, survival, competition. The Terrans taught us we understood nothing." The chamber fell silent except for the hum of the archive systems. "They were not cruel," Ythmara continued, her voice carrying the weight of personal memory. "That was what made them so terrifying. They were not evil conquerors or savage beasts. They were reasonable, intelligent, even kind in their own way. But they never ever gave up." She gestured toward the holographic displays. "We would defeat their expeditions, destroy their ships, block their expansion into new systems, Any other species would have retreated, accepted limitations, found ways to coexist within boundaries. The Terrans would study what had defeated them, adapt, and try again, and again, and again. They called it problem-solving, Yithmara added, and several council members made sounds of distress. To them, every obstacle was simply a puzzle to be solved. Death was a problem. Distance was a problem. Hostile environments were problems. Our resistance was a problem. And they were very, very good at solving problems. Zumthala accessed more files. The archives show increasing desperation among the galactic powers of that era. Traditional warfare failed because the Terrans turned every defeat into a learning experience. Diplomatic isolation failed because they were willing to exist alone if necessary. Economic sanctions failed because their death world had already taught them to survive with nothing. The displays showed star maps with expanding zones of human influence. Not through conquest, but through simple, relentless expansion. They would find empty systems and colonize them. They would discover hostile environments and adapt to them. They would encounter other species and somehow convince them to join their cause. The Terran Confederation, Yithmara said, grew to span hundreds of systems, not through force but through something more frightening. They made allies of everyone they met by being genuinely helpful. They solved problems that had plagued species for millennia. They shared their technologies freely. They protected weaker civilizations from stronger ones. Then why, Chancellor Vexhai asked, did the galaxy fear them? The ancient counselor's expression grew sad. Because we realized they would never stop growing. Never stop expanding, never stop solving problems. And eventually they would decide that the galaxy's biggest problems were the old powers who had tried to contain them. They were too successful, too capable, too impossible to predict or control. Zumthala accessed the final set of files. The Great Disappearance occurred 100,000 years ago. All Terran colonies, ships, and communications simply stopped. Their entire confederation vanished over the course of a single galactic year. No distress signals, no signs of warfare, no explanation. We assumed, Yithmara concluded, that they had finally met something they couldn't solve. Something that had destroyed them completely. The galaxy celebrated. Children stopped having nightmares about the endless humans. We told ourselves we were safe. Chancellor Vexhai looked around the chamber at the faces of beings from across the galaxy. And now they're back. No, said Yithmara quietly. Now we know they never left. They've been on Terra all this time. Growing, learning, preparing, and they've chosen to return. The silence in the chamber was absolute. The question, Yithmara added, is whether they remember what they were, or if they've become something even more dangerous during their long isolation. Above them, in the diplomatic quarters, Ambassador Sarah Chen was trying to understand why her simple introduction had caused such panic. She had no idea that her words had awakened the galaxy's deepest fears, or that civilizations across the stars were already beginning to prepare for what they believed might be the end of everything they had built. The news traveled faster than light itself, carried by quantum communication networks that connected every civilized world in the galaxy. Within 6 hours of the council session, emergency broadcasts were being transmitted to homeworlds across thousands of star systems. The message was simple and terrifying. Terra had returned. On Kethmora Prime, the planetary government called an emergency session for the first time in 12,000 years. The ancient towers that housed their ruling council filled with representatives who had never expected to face a crisis of this magnitude. The oldest among them remembered the stories their grandparents had told, stories they had assumed were myths. The deep archives confirm it, announced Prime Minister Yexkala, her tentacles shaking as she spoke. The humans from Sol 3 are the children of Terra. The blood tests from their diplomatic samples match the genetic markers in our oldest records. Across the chamber, representatives from various Kethmoran colonies displayed the same fear their delegate at the council had shown. Some had already begun drafting evacuation plans for their outer settlements. On the corporate world of Veltani Station, the news hit the galactic markets like an asteroid impact. Stock prices crashed as traders began liquidating assets with desperate speed. The Unified Trading Consortium, which had maintained stability across dozens of economic systems for millennia, watched helplessly as panic selling triggered automatic trading suspensions. Executive Administrator Quilmon stood before the emergency board meeting, his feathered crest flattened with stress. Our economic models don't account for this scenario, he admitted. The last time Terrans were active in the galaxy, they revolutionized entire industries overnight. They turned scarcity into abundance and made our most profitable ventures obsolete. What are the projections? Asked board member Hexarala. If they maintain their historical pattern, Quilmon replied, they'll solve resource distribution problems that have kept us profitable for thousands of years. They'll make our shipping monopolies unnecessary, our energy cartels redundant, and our information networks primitive. The board sat in stunned silence. They were not afraid of war or conquest. They were afraid of being made irrelevant through simple human efficiency. On the military fortress world of Drexhan Sigma, General Court Hala stood before holographic displays showing the defensive positions of the combined fleet. His species had been warriors for 50,000 years, had fought in every major galactic conflict, and had never known defeat. Today, for the first time in his military career, he was considering surrender without a fight. Our tactical computers have finished analyzing the historical data, he reported to his assembled commanders. The Terrans never lost a war. Not one. They were defeated in battles, yes, but every defeat taught them something new. They adapted faster than we could develop new strategies. Commander Yixtal, whose scales showed stress patterns, asked the question everyone was thinking. What are our chances in direct military confrontation? According to our analysis, Korthala replied, we might win the first engagement. They've been isolated for 100,000 years, so their technology might be behind ours. But if historical patterns hold, they'll study our tactics, adapt their approaches, and win every subsequent battle. The computer models suggest complete strategic defeat within 18 months. The military commanders exchanged glances. They were trained to fight impossible odds, but this was different. This was fighting an enemy that used every defeat as education. Meanwhile, in the diplomatic quarters of the council station, Ambassador Sarah Chen was becoming increasingly frustrated with the lack of communication. Her team had been provided with excellent accommodations and assured they were honored guests, but no one would explain the panic their introduction had caused. Dr. Martinez had spent hours analyzing the biological samples their hosts had requested, trying to understand why routine genetic profiles had caused such alarm. Dr. Kim, their xenobiologist, was reviewing every piece of cultural data they had shared, looking for anything that might have been misinterpreted as threatening. I think I found something, Dr. Kim announced, looking up from her portable computer. I've been analyzing the translation logs from our introduction. When you said Terra, the translator tagged it with some unusual linguistic markers. Sarah looked over her colleague's shoulder at the analysis. What kind of markers? Ancient ones. The translation system has been comparing our use of Terra with historical records. According to this data, the word Terra appears in galactic archives dating back over 100,000 years. It's flagged as a significant historical designation. Dr. Martinez joined them, his face showing concern. Significant how? The system won't tell me, Dr. Kim replied. The relevant files are classified at levels we don't have access to, but the linguistic analysis suggests that when we introduced ourselves as being from Terra, we weren't just giving them a planet name. We were claiming a historical identity. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Are you saying that humans have been in space before? That we've had contact with galactic civilization? Before Dr. Kim could answer, their door chimed softly. Sarah opened it to find Chancellor Vexhai standing in the corridor, his crystal form dimmed to barely visible levels. He looked tired in ways she hadn't known were possible for his species. Ambassador Chen, he said quietly, we need to talk. Sarah gestured for him to enter, but he shook his massive head. Not here. There are things you need to see, records you need to understand. But first, I must ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Of course, Sarah replied. Does your species have any memory of space travel before your recent development? Any myths, legends, or stories about ancestors among the stars? Sarah thought carefully. We have stories about gods coming from the sky, myths about ancient advanced civilizations, but nothing we've ever taken as historical fact. Why? Vexhai was quiet for a long moment. Because according to our records, your people built an interstellar confederation that spanned hundreds of worlds. You were not just in space, Ambassador Chen. You were one of the galaxy's major powers. The human team exchanged shocked glances. Dr. Martinez was the first to speak. That's impossible. Our archaeological records show continuous development on Earth. We have no gaps in our history large enough for a galactic civilization. That, said Vexhai, is what makes your return so terrifying. If you truly have no memory of what you were, it means you've been on Terra for 100,000 years, developing in isolation. It means we have no idea what you've become. Sarah felt the weight of galactic history pressing down on her. Chancellor, what exactly do your records say we were? The most successful species the galaxy had ever seen, he replied, and the most dangerous not because you were cruel but because you were unstoppable. You never accepted that anything was impossible. You treated every challenge as a problem to be solved, every limitation as a temporary inconvenience. He paused, his crystal form flickering with what Sarah was learning to recognize as deep anxiety. The galaxy spent 50,000 years trying to contain you and failed. You didn't conquer us with superior weapons or larger numbers. You simply outlasted every attempt to limit you, adapted to every challenge we presented, and continued growing. When you finally disappeared, we thought we were safe. Now you're back, and we don't know if you're the same species that left, or if you've spent 100,000 years becoming something even more formidable. Sarah looked at her team, seeing her own confusion reflected in their faces. They had come to the stars seeking friendship and knowledge. Instead, they had discovered that humanity apparently had a reputation that could terrify an entire galaxy. Chancellor, she said finally, I think we need to see those records. Across the galaxy, military fleets were mobilizing, governments were declaring emergency sessions, and economists were calculating the cost of potential evacuation. All because 5 humans had introduced themselves by name and revealed that the galaxy's greatest fear had never really gone away. It was waiting on a small planet called Earth, and it had just decided to come home. The massive crystal dome stretched high above the gathered representatives, its walls shimmering with colors that had no names in human language. Ambassador Sarah Chen walked slowly down the central aisle, her small team of 5 humans following, behind her. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the vast space, mixing with the sounds of 1,000 different breathing patterns, clicks, whistles, and hums. Sarah had seen the recordings, of course. She had studied every available file about the Galactic Council for months, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of standing in a room with 847 different alien species. To her left, she saw beings that looked like living trees, their bark-like skin shifting between brown and green. To her right, creatures made of what appeared to be liquid metal flowed and reformed constantly in their seats. The air itself was a carefully balanced mixture that could support most of the galaxy's life forms. It smelled strange to Sarah, like ozone mixed with flowers she had never encountered. Her breathing apparatus felt bulky against her face, but it was a small price to pay for this moment. Dr. Martinez, the team's scientist, walked beside her with wide eyes. He kept pointing at different species, whispering excitedly about their possible biology. Sarah had to remind him twice to focus. This was the most important diplomatic meeting in human history. The council chamber was arranged in a spiral, with the newer species near the outside and the older civilizations closer to the center. The humans were being escorted to a spot about halfway in, which Sarah took as a good sign. They were not being treated as primitives. Chancellor Vexhai stood at the center of the spiral. He was impressive, even by the standards of this remarkable gathering. His body was made of living crystal that caught and reflected light in beautiful patterns. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, and his voice, when he spoke, resonated through the chamber like a musical instrument. Welcome, young ones from the Sol system, his voice boomed. We gather today to formally recognize a new member of our galactic community. For 6 months we have exchanged messages. Today we meet face to face. Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Everything depended on making a good impression. Earth had so much to gain from joining this galactic civilization: advanced technology, new scientific knowledge, trade partners, and friends among the stars. The future of humanity rested on the next few minutes. The Chancellor gestured toward Sarah. Please, representative of Sol 3, introduce your species to the Council. Tell us who you are and where you come from, so that we may record your people in our great archive. Sarah stepped forward and activated her translation device. She had practiced this speech hundreds of times, but her mouth still felt dry. She looked around at the incredible diversity of life surrounding her. Some species had eyes like hers. Others had sensory organs she could not even identify. All of them were watching her with what seemed like friendly curiosity. She cleared her throat and began to speak. Honored Chancellor, respected members of the Galactic Council, I am Ambassador Sarah Chen. I represent the human species of the 3rd planet in the Sol system. She paused, feeling confident. The mood in the room seemed warm and welcoming. We are grateful for this opportunity to join the galactic community. We come in peace seeking friendship and knowledge. Several alien beings made sounds that her translator indicated were expressions of approval. We are called humans, Sarah continued, and our world has several names in our many languages. Most commonly we call it Earth, but in our oldest tongues, the name our ancestors used was Terra. The word left her lips and seemed to hang in the air. The vast chamber, which moments before had been filled with the sounds of hundreds of different life forms, fell completely silent. Sarah noticed the change immediately. The friendly rustling and clicking had stopped. Even the mechanical hums of various life support systems seemed quieter. She looked around, confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere. Near the center of the chamber, an ancient-looking being that resembled a massive sea creature began to shake. Its tentacles, which had been gently waving in the artificial current of its tank, went rigid. The water around it began to bubble as if it were in distress. A delegate that looked like a collection of floating geometric shapes suddenly dropped toward the floor, its patterns flashing urgent colors. Sarah's translator was picking up what sounded like distress calls, but she could not understand why. Dr. Martinez moved closer to her. "Sarah," he whispered, "something's wrong. Look at their vital signs displays." Sarah followed his gaze to the biometric readouts visible above many of the delegation seats. Heart rates, or their equivalent, were spiking across the chamber. Several species were showing signs that her briefings had taught her to recognize as extreme stress or fear. Chancellor Vexhi's crystal form had dimmed noticeably. The beautiful patterns of light that had been dancing across his surface just moments before had faded to a dull gray. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and it carried none of the musical quality from before. Did you say Terra?" The word came out like he was afraid to speak it. Sarah looked around at her team, all of whom appeared as confused as she felt. This was not the reaction they had expected to their formal introduction. "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice uncertain now. "Terra is one of our names for our homeworld. Is there some problem with our designation?" A sound rippled through the chamber that Sarah's translator could not interpret. It was not quite a gasp, not quite a moan, but something that spoke of deep, ancient fear. Near the front of the chamber, a being that looked like it was made of living shadow began to retreat toward the exits. The elderly Kethmoran delegate, a species Sarah knew had been part of the council for over 50,000 years, suddenly activated what appeared to be emergency life support. The being's breathing became rapid and shallow, and it began making sounds that needed no translation. It was terrified. "Chancellor," Sarah said, stepping forward with her hands raised in what she hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "I don't understand what's happening. Have we said something wrong? We come in peace. We mean no harm to anyone." But her words seemed to make things worse. Several more delegates began moving toward the exits. Others were frantically operating what appeared to be communication devices, likely sending messages to their homeworlds. Chancellor Vexhi slowly turned his massive crystal form toward the council's inner circle, where the oldest and most respected species maintained their positions. His voice, when it came, was heavy with something that sounded like dread. "Summon the archive keepers," he commanded. "Bring the old records, the ones from the deep storage." "Chancellor," Sarah tried again, "please help us understand. We don't know what we've done wrong." Vexhi looked at her, and in his crystal features Sarah saw something she had not expected to see in the leader of an advanced galactic civilization. She saw fear. "You have not done anything wrong, young human," he said quietly. "But if you are truly from Terra, if that name means what we think it means, then the galaxy has much to fear." The chamber erupted in chaos as delegates began streaming toward the exits. Sarah stood in the center of the spiral, surrounded by her small team, watching their dreams of peaceful first contact collapse around them. They had come to the stars seeking friendship, but somehow, just by speaking their world's oldest name, they had brought terror to the galaxy. She did not understand why, but she was about to learn that some names carry more weight than planets, and some reputations echo across time in ways that can shake the foundations of civilizations. The final council session began at dawn on the station's artificial day cycle. Representatives from across the galaxy had spent 3 sleepless days analyzing the test results, and the conclusions were both terrifying and impossible to ignore. The humans had passed every test, confirming their identity as the descendants of Terra. But something else had been revealed in those ancient records, something that changed everything. Archivist Zumthala stood before the assembled council, her ancient form trembling with the weight of discovery. In her 6 arms she held data crystals that contained the deepest archives, records that had been sealed for so long that their encryption had required teams of linguists to decode. Honored Council, she began, her voice heavy with the burden of truth. I must report a discovery that changes our understanding of galactic history. The records we have relied upon for 100,000 years are incomplete. They have been edited, corrupted, and in some cases deliberately falsified. A murmur of shock rippled through the chamber. The archives were considered sacred, the unalterable record of galactic civilization. The suggestion that they had been tampered with was almost unthinkable. What kind of falsification? Chancellor Vexhai asked, his crystal form flickering with anxiety. Zumthala activated holographic displays that filled the chamber with overlapping data streams. The records show evidence of systematic revision during the period immediately following the Terran disappearance. Details of first contact, records of diplomatic exchanges, and accounts of Terran aggression all show signs of modification. She highlighted specific sections of the data. The original records, recovered from the deepest encryption layers, tell a very different story about the Terrans and their relationship with galactic civilization. The chamber fell silent as the true history began to unfold. The first contact with Terra was not a rescue mission, Zumthala continued. It was a scouting expedition searching for new worlds to exploit. The early galactic powers had identified Terra as a planet rich in resources, and they assumed its hostile environment meant any native life would be primitive and easily controlled. New holographic displays showed the original contact reports, unedited and unfiltered. The images revealed not the monstrous conquerors of legend, but a species that had welcomed galactic visitors with curiosity and hope. The Terrans were eager to join galactic civilization. Zumthala read from the ancient files. They offered to share their survival technologies, their problem-solving methods, and their resources in exchange for knowledge and friendship. The early contact teams reported that Terran hospitality exceeded all expectations. Chancellor Vexhai moved closer to the displays, his form brightening with confusion. Then how did they become the threat described in our histories? Ancient Counselor Yithmara stepped forward, her expression filled with shame that had been carried for millennia. Because we made them into one, she said quietly. I was there. I remember what really happened, though I have spent 100,000 years trying to forget. The chamber turned toward her, and in her ancient features, beings from across the galaxy saw something they had not expected. Guilt. The Terrans were everything the records claimed, Yithmara continued. They were brilliant problem solvers, impossible to discourage, and capable of surviving anything. But they were also kind, generous, and eager to help others. That combination terrified the galactic powers. She gestured toward the historical displays. The Terrans began solving problems that had kept entire industries profitable. They developed technologies that made resource scarcity obsolete. They offered aid to struggling colonies without asking for anything in return. Within decades, they had made half of our economic systems unnecessary and most of our political structures irrelevant. The implications hung in the air like a physical weight. So we convinced ourselves they were dangerous, Yithmara admitted. We spread rumors about Terran aggression. We classified their helpful interventions as conquests. We turned their generosity into evidence of manipulation. We created the monster we feared because we couldn't admit we feared their success. Archivist Zumthala activated another set of files. The economic records from the period support Counselor Yithmara's account. Terran involvement in galactic affairs consistently resulted in improved conditions for all parties, reduced conflicts, and increased prosperity. There are no records of unprovoked Terran aggression. Then why did they disappear? Asked Counselor Drexhan. Because we forced them to, Yithmara replied. The galactic powers of that era formed a coalition to contain Terran expansion. We didn't attack them directly. We were too afraid of their capabilities. Instead, we isolated them diplomatically, cut off their trade relationships, and spread propaganda about the Terran threat. She paused, her ancient form showing the weight of remembered shame. The Terrans tried to maintain peaceful relations. They offered compromises, accepted limitations on their expansion, and even agreed to restrict their technological sharing. But it was never enough. The galaxy had decided they were too dangerous to exist freely, and every peaceful gesture was interpreted as evidence of their cunning. The holographic displays showed the final communications between Terra and the galactic community. They were not threats or demands, but pleas for understanding and offers of continued cooperation. The last message from Terra, Zumthala read from the archives, was a simple statement. We withdraw to avoid the war you seem determined to force upon us. We hope that when you are ready to accept friendship without fear, you will find us still willing to offer it. The chamber was completely silent. They didn't disappear because they were defeated, Ythmara concluded. They chose isolation to prevent a galactic war that would have cost billions of lives. They sacrificed their dreams of joining galactic civilization to protect the very people who had rejected them. In the diplomatic quarters above, Ambassador Sarah Chen was unaware of the revelations unfolding in the council chamber. She was working with her team to prepare for what they hoped would be productive negotiations, still confused by the fear their introduction had caused. I've been thinking about what Chancellor Vexhai said, Dr. Martinez commented as he reviewed their cultural exchange materials. About us having been in space before. What if some of our myths and legends are based on real history? You mean, like the stories about ancient advanced civilizations? Dr. Kim asked. Not just advanced, Sarah said thoughtfully, but civilizations that supposedly vanished because they became too proud, too ambitious. What if those weren't morality tales? What if they were warnings about what happened when our ancestors reached for the stars? Before anyone could answer, their door chimed. Chancellor Vexhai entered, but his appearance was different. His crystal form was brighter than they had ever seen it, and he moved with what appeared to be a mixture of determination and deep sadness. Ambassador Chen, he said, the council has reached its conclusions. We need to speak honestly about what your return means to the galaxy. Sarah gestured for him to sit, though his crystalline form didn't require furniture. Chancellor, I hope our tests have convinced you that we come in peace. They have, Vexhai replied. But they have also revealed something else. Something about our history that we have spent 100,000 years trying to forget. He activated a small holographic projector and filled the room with images from the newly recovered archives. Sarah and her team watched in amazement as the true story of humanity's first venture into the galaxy unfolded before them. Your ancestors were not the monsters our legends described, Vexhai explained. They were explorers and problem solvers, much like yourselves. The galaxy feared them not because they were cruel, but because they were too successful, too generous, and too capable of making our established systems obsolete. Sarah stared at the historical records, seeing faces that looked remarkably like modern humans working alongside alien species in apparent harmony. What happened to them? We drove them away, Vexhai said simply. The galaxy chose fear over friendship, and your ancestors chose exile over war. They returned to Terra and waited, hoping that someday we would be ready to accept what they offered. Dr. Martinez leaned forward, studying the technical specifications in the historical files. These technologies, some of them are similar to theoretical frameworks we've been developing on Earth. It's like we've been independently rediscovering our own heritage. That, said Vexhai, is what makes your return both hopeful and terrifying. You have not only maintained the capabilities that once made Terra legendary, you have improved upon them, and yet... He paused, his crystal form flickering with something that might have been hope. And yet you still offer friendship to those who once rejected you. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the vast council station where hundreds of species worked together in the harmony her ancestors had once hoped to join. Chancellor, what does the council want from us now? The same thing your ancestors offered, he replied. A chance to start again. But this time, we want to do it right. The formal ceremony took place 3 days later in the Great Council Chamber. Representatives from across the galaxy witnessed as Ambassador Sarah Chen accepted membership in the galactic community on behalf of humanity. But this time,